take me home to the place I belong. West Virginia, Mountain Mama, take me home, country roads.
Earlier this year, I borrowed my dad's Tesla to go visit my aunt who lived in the countryside. I'm a 24-year-old guy, and I love driving, especially my dad's car, so I was glad he let me take it. The road trip took me through some pretty remote areas, but it was a pretty smooth drive heading over. I passed through one small town that had a charging station for the car. Whilst I was there recharging the Tesla, I got quite a lot of attention. Apparently not many electric cars came through the area, and they had lots of questions for me. I traveled the rest of the way with no issues, and I stayed with my aunt for a few days and eventually decided to head back home on a sunny afternoon. I began my journey around 3 o'clock. The first part of the drive was through a busy town, and after that, I passed through some quiet suburban neighborhoods. But as I was taking the same route back, I soon found myself once again on the long narrow highway that seemed to stretch and turn endlessly. It was peaceful, but as the hours passed, I started to feel more tired. To keep myself awake, I turned on the radio quite loud, hoping it would wake me up a bit. I squinted at the road, trying to focus, and that's when I noticed a small glimmer of light in the distance. It was the reflection of my car's headlights on another vehicle parked by the side of the road. As I approached, it became evident that the car was abandoned. It was dark, and the windows were tinted. The area was quite remote, and the thought of getting stranded there was unsettling. The nearest town was an hour's drive back. I continued my journey but kept my eyes open, just in case someone was nearby. A few minutes later, I noticed a blindingly bright light in my rearview mirror. The intense glare made it impossible to see the car, only their dazzling lights. They seemed to be getting closer, so I reduced my speed, thinking they would soon overtake. But as I continued down the road, I saw something unsettling up ahead. There was another car right in the middle of the road, blocking my path completely. The car had its lights turned off, and I didn't see it until I was almost right upon it. I slammed on the brakes as soon as I realized what was happening. The lights in the rearview mirror kept getting brighter. I could hear the sound of an approaching vehicle behind me. I decided to turn my car around to escape the situation, but when I looked back, there was another car parked diagonally behind me, effectively sealing off any retreat. Suddenly, it all clicked in my mind. I heard the doors of the cars around me opening and closing. Panic coursed through my veins. Without thinking, I veered off the road, plowing into the trees, attempting to bypass the obstructions and get to the other side of the road, past the parked cars. I was so preoccupied with avoiding trees and avoiding getting my car stuck that I didn't even look to see if the people were chasing me. About 10 seconds after driving off the road, a gunshot echoed. I looked back and they were chasing me. The bullet hit somewhere in front of my car. Fear and adrenaline pulsed through me as I continued maneuvering around the twisted dirt road. Another shot rang out, hitting the back of my car. I was driving like a maniac, going full speed through these tight trees, desperately trying to lose them. My Tesla was impressively handling the practically off-road adventure that I'd pushed it through. Eventually, I could see that I lost them, but I didn't slow down until I hit the highway again. It took about 10 minutes of driving before I regained enough cell phone reception to call the police. The attackers didn't catch up, and as far as I know, they were never apprehended. To this day, I can't help but wonder about how they had such an elaborate setup. Had they spotted me coming in an expensive car and somehow thrown together a plan? Was it the guys I'd been speaking to when charging my car? I told them that I was going to be heading back through in a few days. It really bothers me not knowing, but as you can imagine, I'm not allowed to drive my dad's Tesla anymore. Making these videos takes a lot of time and effort, so your support is appreciated. It all started on a sunny day in college. I had just finished my last class and was excited to get back to my dorm room. Once I arrived back in my dorm, I quickly got on my computer. I was anxious to see what new websites awaited me. A while back, my brother had sort of joined me up to a dark web mailing list where people would send me interesting sites they found. He was a complete computer genius. From software encoding to Photoshop and video making, he was a wizard with all of it. One day I received a message from an unknown user. It said, "Chat to real people from the past." I thought it could be fun, so I clicked on it. The web page loaded, and there was nothing on the screen besides a chat box and a button to search for a new person to talk to. I clicked on the button to find a new person to chat with, and it took some time, but eventually I connected with somebody. There was no text or anything. Then, all of a sudden, I received a message. It read, "Dear friend, I am writing this internet mail to anyone who cares to read it. I am soon to be a father to twins. I hope this mail reaches you in good condition. We're off to see the new Star Wars, The Empire Strikes Back, at the theater to celebrate." New Star Wars. That movie was over 30 years old at this point. This had to be some kind of lame joke, I thought to myself. There was no way a guy in the 1980s was communicating with me. I decided to play along and thought it was all in good fun. "Yeah, I wouldn't call that movie new. I watched that when I was a kid." He replied saying, "What are you talking about? The opening night is tonight. You must be thinking of a different movie, unless you live abroad and it came out early there." "No. I'm a college kid in America," I replied. I went on to list every Star Wars movie and TV show that exists since then. "I think you have a very strong imagination," the guy replied. He wrote a long message telling me that they only have plans for a certain amount of movies and that he knows his stuff. He reminded me of my dad. He was a major Star Wars fan. I was fully indulged with the time travel role play and told him that I knew a massive spoiler for The Empire Strikes Back. I was respectful enough to ask him if he wanted to hear it, and he confidently replied, challenging me to spoil it for him. "If you've seen the movie, you know which one I'm talking about." He laughed and told me that's impossible, and mentioned that he was heading off to the theater. He stopped replying at this point, so I assumed that the fun little role play was over. It was quite wholesome, and the guy really played the part well, speaking like someone who'd only just figured out what email was and with a polite tone throughout. I went about my day, probably studied a bit less than I should have, and had a small chat with my brother. I told him about the guy from the 80s, and he laughed and told me he'll have to check that website out. He was much more nerdy, and he was really into all that stuff. He was a bit on the antisocial side, so the dark web was his happy place. Hours later, I heard a ding. I'd left the website open without noticing. The 80s guy had actually replied. He was going crazy, asking me how I knew about the big spoiler, and speculating that I must have had early access or worked on the film. We had a further back and forth about how I lived in 2023, and I really played into the part about being in the future, teasing him about the technology we have here. Part of me enjoyed the role play, even though that usually wasn't my thing. He asked for my name, but I was smart enough not to give someone on the dark web any details about myself. So I asked what he was called, and I felt my stomach twist when he told me. Alfie Rogers. This was suddenly not a very fun conversation. That was my dad's name. This person obviously had information on me. They must have pinged my IP address, found out my name, and did some basic background research on Ancestry.com and all those other websites that exist nowadays. Alright, you know my dad's name, this isn't funny. What do you want? I asked him, knowing that this kind of thing usually turns into a blackmail attempt or a twisted game. What do you mean? He replied. Still deep in the role play. There's no way that you just pulled out a random name, and it happened to be my dad's name, so you know who I am. What do you want? Even as I called him out, he still didn't budge. He confidently asserted that he was called Alfie Rogers and that he was living in the 1980s. He started to list a bunch of personal details to prove he was a real person. He knew where my dad was born, where his parents came from, my mother's name, her parents, the car he had, everything. It was really disturbing. I'm pretty good with computers, so I know just how much information you can get from historical online records, but this was impressively creepy. Whoever it was, they were really good at this, and they must have planned this for some time. I thought about a question I could ask him, something only my dad could really answer. I found the perfect question. We had an old dog when I was a kid, and unfortunately we had no photos of her. Nobody else would know about this dog. There's absolutely no way it was on any database. So I asked him, "Who is Poppy?" "Poppy. That's my dog." "How did you know the name of my dog?" "She's a border collie. She's sat with me right now." "That's creepy. How did you do that?" I started freaking out. I don't believe in stuff like this, in time travel or having conversations with the past, but whoever this man was had too much information about my family history. It just didn't make sense. He answered every question I threw at him. I think I spent hours quizzing him on his entire life and eventually accepting that whoever or whatever this person was, I felt like I was talking to my dad when he was my age. I'd settle past the discomfort, enjoying every moment of this conversation. Though I did ask one thing from him. If he really did exist in the past, and he really was my dad, then I wanted him to take some pictures of Poppy. He laughed and told me he'd get right on it. He told me he had to get going, and that he loves how clever computers are. I don't think he fully grasped the situation, but he happily played along as if he was talking to his real son. I asked him to tell Poppy I miss her, and even though I highly suspected that this was some strange AI or a wholesome role player, I told him I loved him. Funnily enough, he replied saying that he loved me, and finished with, "Can't wait to meet you." Then we ended the conversation. A few weeks passed. I truly felt the happiest that I'd been in a long time. It had been hard living without a dad. He had a heart attack a year before I left for college. But that conversation really gave me a feeling of closure. I felt like I'd navigated my grief and allowed myself to start healing. I'd occasionally check back on that website but never saw anything from him. I suppose it was a one-off thing. Over the next few months I started to think about that conversation less and really started to live my life again. It was Christmas time and I went back home to visit family. It was the second Christmas without him, and the lack of his presence was still heavily evident, but we enjoyed the holiday and I enjoyed seeing my mom and my brother. On the last night before I returned to college, my mom remembered that she had something for me. She brought me an old VHS. It was Star Wars, Empire Strikes Back. I knew what a VHS was, but they'd been extinct for about 20 years, so I wasn't sure why she was giving it to me. "Open it," she said. I pried open the clunky case and looked inside. Well, shit. There was a whole collection of photos of Poppy, dozens of them. Posing with the whole family, including me and my brother when we were just babies. There were some photos of my dad posing with the dog too. It was surreal, and I was too emotional to think about how these had come to be. There was a note attached. "For my brilliant children, may the force be with you." He was always a bit of a dork. My mom said to me, "I thought we didn't have any photos of Poppy. I don't even remember your dad taking these." A glimpse of happiness and nostalgia was noticeable in her voice. "But your brother found them a few weeks ago." I gave her a big hug and went to find my brother. I told him how great it was that he found them and started to look through them. I told him all about the website and the man from the past who claimed to be my dad, and that we even had a conversation about him taking photos of the dog. He was happy to listen and go through the photos with me, but he was his usual quiet self and didn't have much to say other than a few positive comments on the photos. He hadn't been the same since he passed. But it was nice to see him with a smile for the first time in a while. So that's my story about my time-traveling conversation with my dad. Sometimes it completely freaks me out, and I stay up all night thinking about it. Other times, I just feel comfortable knowing that something beyond my comprehension happened to me. Whether it was an incredibly talented hacker or a crazy AI, I don't know. But I tend to avoid the dark web now. I think I got lucky with this encounter. It was only a matter of time before I met someone who would use that information for the wrong reasons. I have some of my own theories about that story, but I want to hear yours in the comments. If you're enjoying so far, please remember to like the video. In the 90s, before everyone had cell phones, my Girl Scout troop was camping in a state park when a terrible storm came through the area with major flood warnings. The rangers at the park frantically came through every campsite and evacuated everyone to higher ground. Everyone, that is, except my group and the Boy Scouts in the site next to us. We went to bed with light rain, but woke in the middle of the night to our tents collapsing from the water quickly rising. The Boy Scouts, they were 12 to 16 years old, we were between 7 and 9, helped us quickly pack our site into our cars. Unfortunately, the roads were too dangerous to drive because we couldn't see how deep the water was. And we didn't know if any sections of the road had washed out. We abandoned all the vehicles and used the map that the scout leaders had to find someplace that wouldn't be flooded. A few miles away there were treehouse cabins that were built around a tree and lofted 15 feet in the air. It was decided that we needed to move quickly, and that was our best shot. The older boys and the adults carried the smallest girls when it became clear that the wind was preventing them from staying on their feet. The wind and rain soaked everyone through to the skin. We made it to the cabins, and the adults broke in and raided the emergency supplies there for space blankets. There was no way to build a fire because there was no firewood. It had been especially dry this year, and starting campfires was forbidden due to risk of starting a forest fire. I remember shivering for hours, all of us girls in the middle of a huddle on the floor with the boys on the outside trying their best to keep us warm. One of the boys asked us if we knew any Girl Scout songs. We sang every song we knew, and the leaders taught us a few more that they had learned. At some point we convinced the boys to sing in rounds with us. The storm lasted through the night. Some girls started crying, and I remember one had a panic attack. The sound of the storm battering away at the cabin would send creaks all along throughout the space. The fact that we were essentially in a treehouse made the whole thing even more scary. I was convinced that we were going to be blown over and either fly away or all be crushed when we hit the ground. It was impossible to even see what was happening outside. You could just hear the sound of the water, the rustling of the trees, and the creaking of the cabin. If we didn't die from the cold, we'd definitely die in the rushing water. The storm continued battering the cabin long throughout the night. Eventually, once we were a bit more dry, a bunch of us managed to fall asleep. I'd been lying there for what felt like hours, struggling to doze off due to the loud banging. I'd constantly jump up when I was half asleep and couldn't quite get there. In the early hours of the morning, I was lying down staring at the ceiling when I started to finally not be able to keep my eyes open anymore. I closed them and felt myself slipping away. A branch flew through one of the windows in the cabin, throwing glass everywhere and waking up everyone. The room was full of screams, and the camp leaders were frantically trying to calm us down whilst figuring out what had happened. The place was still really dark, and a few kids had been cut with the glass. The older boys and the camp leaders helped patch everyone up and dealt with the glass situation. If there was any night to earn some medals, it was definitely this one. We all really came together, and I felt safe with those people, even though the situation was so dangerous. Morning came, the rain slowed down to a light drizzle, and a ranger showed up assessing damage to the park. He discovered us and immediately drove to get help. They returned with a bunch of trucks and all-terrain vehicles and drove us to a location where doctors were on site to evaluate us. It was sheer luck that none of us had anything worse than the chills and a few cuts from the glass. It could have gone worse than it did, and we were unbelievably lucky to have survived at all. We could have easily died in our sleep if the flood had come through all at once instead of slowly rising. If the Boy Scouts hadn't been there, then us small girls could not have made the hike to safety. If we had tried to drive, we would have been washed away.